Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what truly matters. Ford Baxter stood in an empty field, 44 years old and broken, staring at a rusted school bus that most people would call garbage. He'd lost his home, his marriage had fallen apart, and his adult daughter hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. But when Ford looked at that old bus with its flat tires and shattered windows, he didn't see junk. He saw hope. With just his hands and the carpentry skills from better days, he started building something inside that bus, a real home, a fresh start, a way to prove he could change. Would it be enough to bring his daughter back into his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ford Baxter's hands had built beautiful things once. Kitchen cabinets that fit so perfectly you'd swear they'd grown from the walls. Staircases with rails smooth as river stone. Furniture that would outlast the people who bought it. For 15 years, his carpentry business had been the kind of success story people told at county fairs. A local boy who'd learned the trade from his father and turned it into something that mattered. That was before the recession hit. Before the contracts dried up. Before he'd started drinking to quiet the fear that gnawed at him every night when he couldn't make payroll. Now he lived in a motel room on the outskirts of Ridgeland County, and the only thing his hands built anymore were excuses. The Sunset Motor Lodge sat along Route 47 like a monument to better days that never quite arrived. 12 rooms, half of them occupied by people like Ford, folks who'd meant to stay a week and somehow found themselves measuring time in months. The carpet held the ghosts of 1,000 spills, and the walls were thin enough that he knew exactly when Mr. Pacheco, in room 7, came home from his night shift at the meat processing plant. Ford's room smelled like instant coffee and regret. A hot plate sat on the dresser next to a dented kettle. His clothes hung in a closet that couldn't quite close all the way. The bathroom mirror had a crack running through it that made his reflection look like 2 different men trying to occupy the same space. He'd been sober for 6 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. Not that anyone was counting except him. The leather tool belt lay on his bed like an artifact from someone else's life. His father had given it to him the day he'd finished his apprenticeship 23 years ago. The leather was dark with age and honest sweat, worn smooth in all the places his hands had gripped it through thousands of days of work. Each loop and pocket had been positioned exactly where his father's hands had learned they should be, and Ford's hands had learned the same geography. He picked it up now, felt its familiar weight. Some mornings it was the only thing that felt real. His phone sat on the nightstand silent. Ainsley hadn't called in 2 years. His daughter, 24 now, teaching 2nd grade in the city, living a life he only knew about through the occasional Facebook post he shouldn't have been looking at. She'd blocked him 6 months after the divorce, right around the time he'd shown up drunk to her college graduation. That was the last time he'd seen her face in person. The marriage to Shauna had ended the way a building collapses, slowly at first, then all at once. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried longer than most women would have. But there's only so many times you can find your husband passed out in his truck before you start looking at apartments. Only so many promises that get broken before the words stop meaning anything at all. The business had failed first, then the marriage, then his relationship with Ainsley. He'd managed to lose everything that mattered in the space of 3 years, which was almost impressive in its thoroughness. 6 months ago, he'd woken up in a hospital with a blood alcohol level that should have killed him. The doctor, a woman about Ainsley's age, had looked at him with something worse than disgust. She'd looked at him with pity. That was the day he'd stopped drinking, not because he wanted to, not because he'd found religion or had some grand revelation. He'd stopped because he was tired, and because that look in the doctor's eyes reminded him of the last look Ainsley had given him. And because somewhere in the fog of his pickled brain, a small voice had whispered that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep destroying himself. The AA meetings happened in the basement of St. Benedict's Church every Tuesday and Thursday night. Ford sat in the back and mostly listened. He didn't share much. Didn't feel like he had anything to say that the room hadn't heard 1,000 times before. But he kept going, because that's what you did. One day at a time, one meeting at a time, one moment of not picking up a bottle at a time. He'd found odd carpentry jobs around Ridgeland County. Nothing like the custom work he used to do, but enough to keep him fed and pay for the motel room. He'd fix a fence here, build a deck there. Cash jobs, mostly, working for people who didn't ask too many questions about why a man his age was starting over from scratch. The countryside around Ridgeland County was the kind of beautiful that people from cities paid money to look at. Rolling farmland stretched out in every direction, punctuated by stands of oak and maple that turned the hills into patchwork quilts come autumn. The town itself was small, 3,000 people if you counted generously, with a main street that still had a hardware store and a diner and a barber shop where old men gathered to argue about weather and politics. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, which made anonymity impossible, but also meant that people noticed when you were trying to do better. Burton Finch owned 200 acres about 4 miles outside of town. He was 76, weathered as old barnwood, with hands that shook just slightly when he held his coffee cup. His wife, Opal, had passed 5 years back, and he'd been rattling around the farmhouse alone ever since, too stubborn to sell and too tired to work the land the way he used to. Ford had met Burton 3 weeks ago, replacing rotted boards on his front porch. They'd gotten to talking the way men do when they're working with their hands. Short sentences, long silences, comfortable with not filling every moment with noise. "Got an old school bus out in the back 40, Burton had mentioned on Ford's 3rd day there. Been sitting there near 15 years. Eyesore, really. Keep meaning to have it hauled off. Ford had asked to see it, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe just curiosity. Maybe the carpenter in him that still looked at broken things and wondered if they could be fixed. They'd driven out in Burton's truck, bouncing over the rutted path that led through a field of tall grass gone wild. And there it sat, a 1990 Bluebird school bus. Its yellow paint faded to the color of old bone, tires flat and half sunk into the earth, windows either broken or so covered in grime they might as well have been. Most people would have seen garbage. Ford had stood there in the September sun, looking at that bus, and something had shifted in his chest, some combination of desperation and hope that he hadn't felt in years. "What would you take for it?" he'd asked. Burton had looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Take for it? Son, I'd pay you to haul it away." "I don't want to haul it away," Ford had said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke. "I want to live in it." And Burton, bless him, hadn't laughed. He'd just studied Ford with those sharp old eyes, seeing something that Ford wasn't sure was actually there. "You serious?" "I think I am." They'd talked for an hour, standing beside that rusted hulk. Ford had explained, haltingly, carefully, about the motel room, about trying to rebuild, about needing something that was his own. He hadn't mentioned Ainsley, but somehow Burton had understood anyway. "Tell you what," Burton had said finally. "Bus is yours if you want it. You can work on it here long as you need. No rent, no strings. Just promise me you'll do it right. Build something worth building." Ford had shaken the old man's hand, feeling the tremor in those weathered fingers, and wondered if this was what grace looked like. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Ford stood beside the bus in the late morning light, his father's tool belt cinched around his waist, and tried to figure out where to even begin. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Ford was pricing 2x4s at Iris Landfield's hardware store. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he almost didn't answer when he saw the unfamiliar number. But something made him swipe to accept. "Dad?" The word hit him like a fist to the sternum. He hadn't heard Ainsley's voice in 2 years, but he would have known it anywhere, even filtered through phone static, even edged with the careful distance she was keeping between them. Ainsley. His own voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat, stepped away from the lumber aisle toward the front door. "Hi, sweetheart." A pause. He could hear traffic in the background, the ambient noise of a city street. She was probably on her lunch break, standing outside the elementary school where she taught. "I'm calling because I wanted to tell you something before you heard it from someone else." Her words were measured, rehearsed. She'd practiced this conversation. "Preston and I are getting married. In 6 months. May 15th, Preston." The architect she'd been dating for a year, the one Ford had only seen in Facebook photos, tall, clean-cut, the kind of man who probably flossed twice a day and never showed up anywhere drunk. The kind of man Ford had never managed to be. "That's wonderful," Ford managed. He meant it, he did, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Congratulations, really, I'm happy for you." Another pause, longer this time. Ford watched a pickup truck drive past on Main Street, counted the seconds of silence. "I wanted you to know," Ainsley said finally. I haven't decided yet about the wedding. About whether—" She stopped, started again. "Preston thinks I should invite you. He thinks people deserve second chances. And what do you think?" "I think I don't know yet." Her voice cracked slightly, and Ford heard the little girl she'd been underneath the careful adult she'd become. "I think I need to see that you've really changed. Not just stopped drinking, but actually changed. Built something real." Ford looked down at his hands, at the calluses that were finally starting to come back after months of odd jobs. "I understand. Do you?" Now there was heat in her voice, the first real emotion. "Because I've heard you say you understand a lot of times, Dad. I heard it when you missed my 16th birthday because you were too drunk to drive. I heard it when you showed up at my graduation smelling like a distillery. I heard it every time Mom cried herself to sleep because you'd promised this was the last time." Each word was a nail, and Ford stood there and let her hammer them in. He'd earned every single one. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't ask you to believe me. I can only show you." Ainsley was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tired. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I can't do this again. I can't let you break my heart again." "I know. 6 months," she said. "That's how long you have to prove you're different. And then I'll decide about the wedding." The line went dead before Ford could respond. He stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store, phone still pressed to his ear, and felt the weight of those 6 months settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. 6 months to prove he was worthy of walking his daughter down the aisle. 6 months to demonstrate that he'd become someone she could trust again. 6 months to build something real. When he got back to the bus that afternoon, Burton was sitting in a folding chair in the shade of an old oak tree, drinking iced tea from a mason jar. "You look like you got some news," the old man observed. Ford told him about the call, about Ainsley, about the wedding, about having half a year to prove he was worth a second chance. Burton listened without interrupting, the way good listeners do, and when Ford finished, he just nodded slowly. "So what are you going to do?" Ford looked at the bus, really looked at it. The rust eating through the wheel wells, the windows like empty eye sockets, the floor that had rotted through in places, showing dirt and dead grass beneath. "I'm going to make this beautiful," Ford said. "Not just livable, beautiful. Something that proves I can create instead of destroy." Burton raised his jar in a small salute. "Then you better get to work." Ford started that afternoon with a violence that surprised him. He tore out the old bus seats with a crowbar, grunting with the effort, feeling something like rage or grief, or maybe just determination flowing through his muscles. The seats had been bolted to the floor decades ago, and they didn't want to give up their positions easily. Rust had welded them in place, and Ford had to put his whole weight into each pull. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His hands slipped on the crowbar. He swore, words he hadn't used since getting sober, and attacked the seats with renewed fury. By sunset, he'd cleared out the interior. 12 rows of seats lay in a pile beside the bus, like the shed skin of some mechanical creature. His hands were bleeding from half a dozen cuts where rusted metal had caught his palms. He stood inside the empty shell and looked down at the floor. The damage was worse than he'd thought. Whole sections had rotted completely through. Water had been getting in for years, maybe decades, pooling and destroying. He could see earth through the holes, and in some places grass was growing up through the gaps. This was going to be harder than he'd imagined. Burton brought him a sandwich and a bottle of water as the last light drained from the sky. They sat on the ground beside the bus, backs against the warm metal, and ate in comfortable silence. My Opal used to say that sometimes we need to tear something all the way down before we can build it back right, Burton said eventually. Said it about this old barn I was trying to patch. Kept putting new boards over rotten ones, trying to save time and money. Finally collapsed one winter. Had to start from scratch. What did you build? Ford asked. That barn right there. Burton pointed to the sturdy structure about 50 yards away. Took me 2 years working weekends and evenings. But when I was done, it was solid. Still standing 40 years later. Sometimes the long way is the only way that matters. Ford finished his sandwich and looked at his bleeding hands in the darkness. 6 months suddenly felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. I'm scared, he admitted. That I'll fail. That it won't be enough. That she'll never forgive me. Probably right to be scared, Burton said. But you're here anyway. That counts for something. That night, Ford drove back to the motel and stood in front of the cracked mirror in his bathroom. He looked at his reflection, at the man he'd become and the man he was trying to be, and made a promise to the daughter who couldn't hear him. I'll build something beautiful. I'll prove I can change. I'll earn my way back to you. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, pulled out his wallet, and found what he was looking for tucked behind his expired insurance card. A piece of paper, folded small and worn soft from years of carrying. It was a drawing Ainsley had made when she was 7. Crayon on construction paper. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing beside something that might have been a tree house. She'd written across the top in careful block letters, "Me and Daddy building." Ford stared at that drawing until his vision blurred, and then he carefully folded it again and put it back in his wallet. Tomorrow he would start rebuilding the floor. Tonight he would remember why it mattered. 3 weeks into the project, Ford's life had developed a rhythm that felt almost like purpose. He woke at dawn in his motel room, made instant coffee on the hot plate, and drove out to Burton's farm, with the sunrise painting the fields gold and amber. He worked on the bus until noon, then drove back to town for whatever carpentry job he'd lined up, a deck repair here, a cabinet installation there, and returned to the bus in the evening to work until the light failed. His hands remembered the work in a way his mind sometimes forgot. Muscle memory carried him through the technical challenges, the geometric puzzles of working in a curved space where nothing was quite square, and every measurement had to account for the gentle arc of the bus's walls. The floor came first. He'd stripped out all the rotted sections, exposing the metal frame underneath. The bones were good. Burton had been right about that. The structure was sound. It was just the surface that had decayed, and surfaces could be rebuilt. He scavenged lumber from Burton's old barn, weathered boards that had aged into something stronger than new wood, grey and dense and true. He measured each piece 3 times before cutting, the way his father had taught him. Measure 3 times, cut once. Haste makes waste. Do it right or don't do it at all. The old sayings came back to him as he worked, his father's voice in his head, offering guidance across the years and the grave. Iris Landfield's hardware store sat on Main Street between the bank and the post office. It had been there for 40 years, run by Iris's father until his death, then by Iris and her ex-husband, and finally by Iris alone after the divorce. The store smelled like sawdust and machine oil and the particular metallic scent of new nails in cardboard boxes. Ford had been buying supplies there for his odd jobs, always paying cash, always keeping the transactions brief and professional. But on a Tuesday morning, when he came in for wood screws and insulation, Iris waved him over to the counter with an expression he couldn't quite read. She was maybe 50, with grey streaking through dark hair she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands were scarred from years of handling rough materials, and she had the kind of competence that came from running a small business through recessions and changes and the slow death of downtown retail. "I heard about your project," she said without preamble. "The bus conversion." Ford felt his shoulders tense. Small-town gossip traveled faster than weather. "Yeah, Burton mentioned it. Said you're doing good work." She pulled out an invoice pad and started writing. "I'm extending you a line of credit. $500 to start. Pay it off when you can. No interest for the first 6 months. Ford stared at her. Why would you do that? Iris looked up, met his eyes directly. Because I know what it's like to start over from nothing. And because Burton Finch is the best judge of character I know. If he believes in you, that's good enough for me. I could fail, Ford said. You could, Iris agreed. But you're here trying, and that matters. Now, do you want the credit or not? Ford nodded, not trusting his voice. Good. Iris handed him the paper to sign. And Ford, the whole town's not rooting against you. Some of us remember that people can change. He drove back to the farm with 2 rolls of insulation in his truck bed and something uncomfortably close to hope in his chest. Burton brought lunch that day, thick sandwiches and apples from a tree behind his house. They sat in the shade of the oak tree, and Ford worked up the courage to say what he'd been holding back for weeks. I'm an alcoholic, he said, the words feeling both enormous and small at the same time. 6 months sober. Before that, I lost everything that mattered because I couldn't stop drinking. Burton bit into his apple, chewed thoughtfully. Figured it was something like that. Ben doesn't end up starting over at your age without a reason. You're not worried? That I'll relapse, or my Opal was a drinker, Burton said quietly. Back when we first married, her daddy had been a mean drunk, and she'd learned the habit from trying to keep up with him, trying to prove she could hold her liquor like a man. Took her 5 years to quit. Tried 3 times before it stuck. Ford hadn't known that. Burton had only ever spoken of Opal with reverence, like she was something holy. What made it stick the 4th time? She decided she wanted to live more than she wanted to drink, Burton said. And she asked for help instead of trying to white-knuckle it alone. Went to meetings, got herself a sponsor, did the work. Was sober 32 years when she passed. Cancer, not alcohol. Sometimes life just takes what it wants regardless. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the grass. I go to meetings, Ford offered. Tuesdays and Thursdays at St. Benedict's. That's good. Keep going. Burton stood, gathering the sandwich wrappings. Now let's see this floor you've been building. By the end of the 3rd week, Ford had replaced the entire floor with reclaimed barn wood. The boards fit together like pieces of a puzzle, each one carefully measured and cut to account for the bus's curved walls. He'd sanded them smooth and sealed them with 3 coats of polyurethane that brought out the grain and the character of wood that had weathered decades of seasons. It was beautiful. Rough-hewn and honest and strong, he stood inside the empty bus and felt something he hadn't felt in years, pride in his work. A sound outside made him turn. A kid was standing beside the bus, maybe 16 or 17, looking at the pile of old seats and the tools scattered on the ground. You fixing this up? The kid asked. Trying to. The kid was lanky in the way teenagers are, all elbows and knees, with dark hair that fell into his eyes. He wore a T-shirt advertising a band Ford had never heard of, and jeans with deliberate holes in the knees. I'm Trey, he said. Trey Lockwood. I live a couple miles that way. He gestured vaguely east. Mr. Finch told me about what you're doing. Said you could use some help. It's volunteer work, Ford said. Can't pay you. Don't need paying. Need community service hours for school? Got in some trouble, have to work it off. Trey shrugged, trying to look casual about it. But honestly, I just think this is cool. What you're building? Ford studied the kid. Saw himself at that age, before the army, before the marriage, before everything went sideways. Young and trying to figure out where he fit in the world. You know anything about carpentry? Not really. But I'm good with my hands and I follow directions. Ford thought about it. Having help would speed the work considerably, and there was something appealing about passing on the skills his father had taught him, the way things were supposed to be handed down. All right, he said. We'll try it out, but if you show up on time and ready to work. This isn't hanging out. This is building. Trey's face split into a grin. Yes, sir. And don't call me sir. Makes me feel old. What should I call you? Ford works fine. They shook hands, and Ford felt the kid's grip, strong, eager, a little uncertain. When do we start? Trey asked. Ford looked at the bus, at all the work still ahead. The walls to frame, the insulation to install, the windows to replace, the electrical and plumbing to figure out. 6 months suddenly felt like maybe just enough time if he worked smart and didn't waste a single day. "Tomorrow morning," Ford said. 7 o'clock. "Bring work gloves and be ready to learn." Trey showed up at 6:45 the next morning, which told Ford everything he needed to know about the kid's commitment. He arrived on a bicycle that had seen better days, wearing work gloves that were clearly borrowed and too big for his hands. "You're early," Ford observed. "Didn't want to be late." Trey leaned his bike against the oak tree. "What are we doing today?" Ford handed him a crowbar. "We're tearing out the interior panels. Everything's got to come out before we can insulate and rebuild." They worked side by side in the growing heat of the morning, prying away the old panels that had lined the bus's walls and ceiling. The metal underneath was rusty in places, but mostly solid. Each panel came away with a screech of protesting screws and the shower of dirt and debris that had accumulated over decades. As they worked, Ford taught, not lecturing, just explaining as they went, how to find the structural points, how to remove without damaging what you wanted to keep, how to work efficiently without rushing. Trey absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who'd been hungry for this kind of attention. Between panels, he asked questions. Not just about carpentry, but about Ford's life, his work, what had brought him here. Ford found himself answering honestly. About the business he'd built and lost. About the drinking. About trying to earn his way back to a relationship with his daughter. He didn't usually talk this much, but something about working with your hands loosened the tongue. Or maybe it was just that Trey listened without judgment, the way only someone who'd made their own mistakes could. "My dad took off when I was 12. Trey offered during a water break. "Haven't seen him since. Mom works 2 jobs, so I'm on my own most of the time. Got in trouble for tagging the water tower with some friends. That's why I need the community service hours. You good at it?" "The art?" Trey shrugged, embarrassed. "I'm okay. Nothing special." "Let me see." The kid pulled out his phone, showed Ford photos of his work. Tags and pieces, done in spray paint on various surfaces around town. The work was raw but showed real talent, an eye for composition, for color, for the way letters could become shapes that meant something beyond words. "That's not nothing special," Ford said. "That's actually pretty good." Trey ducked his head, pleased. "Thanks. You should do something with that." "The art? Yeah, maybe. Mom wants me to go to community college, get a practical degree. Says art doesn't pay bills." Ford thought about all the beautiful things he'd built over the years, the satisfaction that came from creating something with your own hands. Sometimes practical isn't the same as meaningful. "But you're young. You've got time to figure it out." They finished clearing the interior by noon. The bus was now just a shell, metal frame and floor, everything else stripped away. It looked worse than when they'd started, but Ford knew that was how it had to be. You couldn't build something solid on a rotten foundation. Burton appeared with sandwiches and lemonade, and the 3 of them sat in the shade. The old man asked Trey about school, about his mother, about his plans. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind that happened naturally among people working toward a common purpose. After lunch, they drove to a construction site on the other side of town where a house was being demolished. Ford had gotten permission to salvage materials, and they spent the afternoon pulling insulation from the walls, pink fiberglass bats that were still in good condition, destined for the landfill if Ford didn't take them. "This is how you build on a budget," Ford explained as they loaded the truck. "You find what other people are throwing away and give it new purpose. Like the bus," Trey said. "Like the bus." They installed the insulation over the next 3 days. Ford showed Trey how to measure and cut, how to fit the bats between the metal ribs of the bus's frame, how to wear gloves and a mask because fiberglass was hell on skin and lungs. The work was tedious but necessary. Each section had to be carefully fitted, with no gaps where air could leak through. Ford worked with the patience of someone who understood that quality took time, and Trey matched his pace, learning to value precision over speed. On the 4th day, Iris drove out to the farm in her truck. Ford heard the engine and stepped out of the bus to find her climbing down from the cab, a smile on her weathered face. "Brought you something," she said, walking to the truck bed. "Cedar planks. Customer ordered them for a deck and then backed out of the project. They've been sitting in my warehouse for 6 months. Figured you could use them for interior walls. Ford walked over, ran his hand along the smooth wood. Cedar was expensive, beautiful, fragrant. Iris, I can't. They're already on your account. Mark down 70% because they've been sitting so long. She pulled out the invoice. Consider it an investment in the most interesting thing happening in this town. Ford looked at the planks, then at Iris. Why are you doing this? She leaned against the truck, crossed her arms. You want the real answer? Yeah. 10 years ago, my husband cleaned out our joint account and ran off with a woman from the next county. Left me with a business that was barely breaking even and debt I didn't know we had. I almost lost everything. The store, the house, my mind. She paused, looking out across Burton's fields. People in this town could have written me off. Could have said I was a bad risk, a woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. But they didn't. They extended credit when I needed it. They bought supplies they didn't really need. They showed up when I was at my lowest and said, "We believe you can do this." Iris turned back to Ford. I rebuilt. Took 5 years, but I paid off every penny of debt and made the store profitable again. And I swore that if I ever had the chance to be for someone else what this community was for me, I'd take it. She tapped the invoice against his chest. This is me taking it. Ford accepted the paper, throat tight. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Iris climbed back into her truck. Now get those planks unloaded before the weather turns. That evening, Ford called Ainsley. He'd been putting it off for 3 weeks, afraid of hearing her voice again, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But Iris's story had loosened something in him, made him brave. She answered on the 4th ring. Dad? Hey, sweetheart. I just wanted to check in, let you know I'm still here, still working on that thing I mentioned. A pause. What thing? He'd been vague in their last call, not wanting to tell her about the bus. Afraid she'd think he'd lost his mind. But now, standing in Burton's field with the sun setting and the cedar planks waiting to become walls, he found himself wanting to share it. I'm building something, he said. Home, actually, in an old-school bus. I know that sounds crazy. It does sound crazy, Ainsley said, but there was something in her voice that wasn't quite criticism. Curiosity, maybe. It is crazy, but it's mine, and I'm building it with my own hands. The way I used to build things before. He stopped, started again. I'm doing good work, Ainsley, real work, the kind I'm proud of. Another pause, longer this time. Send me pictures? Ford felt his chest expand. Yeah, I want to see what you're building. They talked for 10 more minutes. Not about the past, not about the wedding. Just about the bus, about the process, about the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. When they hung up, Ford stood holding his phone and realized he was smiling. Trey was watching from where he'd been sorting screws. Good call? Yeah, Ford said. Really good call. That night, he sent Ainsley photos of the bus, the new floor, the insulation, the cedar planks waiting to become walls. He included a shot of the carved detail he'd been working on in the evenings, a simple pattern of leaves and vines that would run along the cabinet trim. She responded an hour later with 3 words. Dad, that's beautiful. Ford read those words a dozen times before sleep, and for the first time in years, he dreamed of building instead of breaking. The cedar walls went up over the course of 2 weeks, and the bus began to smell like a forest. The scent filled Ford's sinuses every morning when he arrived, clean and sharp and promising. He and Trey worked in a rhythm now. The kid anticipating what tool Ford would need next, understanding the logic of how each piece connected to the whole. Ford had designed the interior to maximize the narrow space. The bed would go in the back, raised on a platform with storage underneath. A small kitchen along one side, compact but functional, with a 2-burner propane stove and a sink he'd salvaged from a demolished farmhouse. The other side would have built-in seating that converted to extra sleeping space, more storage, and shelving for books and the small things that made a space feel like home. Every cabinet, every shelf, every surface was being hand-built. Ford couldn't afford to buy pre-made anything, but more than that he didn't want to. This was about craftsmanship, about proving he could still create things that would last. On a Wednesday morning, a man Ford didn't know pulled up in a new Lexus. He was maybe 40, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than actual work. He got out and looked around with an expression that suggested he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. "You Ford Baxter?" the man called. "That's me." Ford set down his router and climbed out of the bus. "I'm Conway Finch, Burton's son." The man didn't offer his hand. "I live in Charlotte. Dad called me last week about some medical bills, so I drove up to check on him." Ford felt his stomach tighten. "He okay? Minor heart incident. Doctor says it's manageable with medication and rest." Conway looked past Ford at the bus. "He also told me about your arrangement here, about you living on his property, working on this." He gestured vaguely at the bus. "Project. I'm grateful to him for letting me use the space." "I'm sure you are." Conway's tone was polite but cold. "Look, I'm going to be direct. My father is 76 years old and recovering from a cardiac episode. I'm concerned about someone taking advantage of his generosity. I'm not accusing you of anything," Conway interrupted. "I'm just saying that I'll be keeping an eye on things. My father has a tendency to trust people more than he should, to see the best in folks even when the evidence suggests otherwise." Ford felt the old shame rising in his throat. The assumption that he was a user, a taker, someone who couldn't be trusted. Part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself. But a larger part recognized that Conway wasn't entirely wrong to be suspicious. Ford's track record didn't exactly inspire confidence. "Your father's been kind to me," Ford said carefully. "I wouldn't do anything to take advantage of that kindness." "Words are easy." Conway pulled out his phone, glanced at it. "I'll be in town for a few more days. We'll see what your actions say." He drove away without another word, leaving Ford standing in the field with anxiety churning in his gut. Burton appeared an hour later, moving slower than usual, his color not quite right. Ford made him sit in the shade and brought him water. "Conway came by," Ford said. "Figured he would." Burton sipped the water. "He called me last night, all worked up about you being a recovering alcoholic. Did some internet searching, found the articles about your business failing." Ford closed his eyes. "Burton, if this is going to cause problems with your family—" "My son is a good man," Burton interrupted. "But he's cautious. Lost money in bad investments a few years back, and now he sees danger everywhere. Doesn't trust easily. He's right to be careful, especially about you." "Maybe, but I'm a grown man who can make his own decisions." Burton set down the water. "I told Conway that what I do with my property is my business, that you've been nothing but respectful and hard-working, that sometimes people deserve a chance to prove they've changed." "What did he say?" "Said he hoped I was right, and that he'd be watching." Burton smiled slightly. "So I guess you better not mess up." Ford tried to match the smile, but couldn't quite manage it. The weight of Conway's suspicion sat heavy on his shoulders. Another person he'd have to prove himself to, another chance to fail spectacularly and confirm everyone's worst assumptions. He threw himself into the work with renewed intensity, as if building faster and better would somehow prove his worth. He worked late into the evenings, long after Trey had gone home, using battery-powered lights to see by as he carved decorative details into the cabinet faces. The carving was something he'd always loved, but rarely had time for in his production work. Leaves and vines, simple geometric patterns, the occasional bird or flower. His hands knew the movements, the way the chisel should bite into the wood, the pressure needed to get clean lines without splitting the grain. On a sleepless night in his motel room, he carved a small wooden bird from a scrap of cedar. Just something to do with his hands, to quiet his mind. It was maybe 3 inches tall, a sparrow with its head tilted as if listening for something. He worked on it for hours, adding detail to the feathers, defining the delicate feet, giving it a personality. When he finished, he set it on the nightstand and stared at it. The bird was beautiful in its simplicity, proof that his hands could still create things worth keeping. The next day, he brought it to the bus and set it on the small shelf he'd installed near what would be the kitchen. A reminder that beauty wasn't always about function. Sometimes it was just about making something because you could. Iris came by that afternoon with more supplies, hinges for the cabinet doors, a small marine-grade sink, copper pipes she'd gotten from a plumber who was upgrading a house downtown. She spotted the wooden bird immediately. "You made that?" "Last night. Couldn't sleep." Iris picked it up carefully, turned it over in her hands. "Ford, this is really good. Like really good. It's just something to mess around with." "No." She looked at him seriously. "This is craftsmanship. You could sell work like this. Custom furniture, decorative pieces. There's a market for handmade quality." Ford shook his head. "I'm not ready to think about starting another business. This," he gestured at the bus, "this is what I need to focus on right now. I understand. But after, when you finish this, think about it." She handed the bird back. "You've got a gift. Would be a shame to waste it." That evening, Ford texted Ainsley a photo of the carved cabinet faces. The pattern he'd created was more elaborate than he'd originally planned. A flowing vine with leaves and small blossoms that wrapped around the cabinet doors, turning functional storage into something approaching art. His phone rang 5 minutes later. "Dad?" Ainsley's voice was different, softer. "Did you really carve those by hand?" "Yeah, I've been working on them in the evenings. They're incredible." "I forgot," she paused. "I forgot how talented you are. When you're sober and focused." The compliment hit him harder than any criticism could have. He sat down heavily on the bus steps, throat tight. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything." "I've been thinking," Ainsley said slowly. "Preston and I are coming up to look at wedding venues in 3 weeks. We're considering this barn venue about an hour from where you are. Maybe, if you're okay with it, we could stop by. See what you're building?" Ford's heart hammered. "You want to visit?" "I want to see it in person." "See you in person?" She sounded nervous, which made him feel slightly better about his own terror. "No promises about anything. I think I'm ready to see if you've really changed." "I have," Ford said, then corrected himself. "I'm trying to. Every day." "Okay." He could hear the smile in her voice. "Okay, Dad, send me the address." After they hung up, Ford sat on the bus steps until full dark, watching the stars come out over Burton's fields. 3 weeks. Ainsley would be here in 3 weeks. She'd see what he'd built, how he'd changed, whether he was worth forgiving. It was everything he'd been working toward, and everything that terrified him. Trey found him there in the darkness. "You all right?" "My daughter's coming to visit," Ford said. "In 3 weeks. That's good, right?" "Yeah, it's good." Ford stood, dusted off his jeans. "Which means we've got 3 weeks to make this place perfect." "It's already pretty great." Ford looked at the bus. His home, his project, his proof. Great isn't good enough. It needs to be extraordinary. 4 months into the build, the bus had transformed into something Ford barely recognized from that first day. The cedar walls glowed warm in the afternoon light. The floor gleamed with its layers of finish. Every surface had been measured, cut, fitted, and installed with the kind of precision that came from caring deeply about the outcome. Ford and Trey installed the electrical system on a Saturday, running wire through channels Ford had carved in the walls, connecting everything to a solar panel array that Burton had helped him mount on the roof. It wasn't a complicated system, just enough to power LED lights, charge his phone, and run a small refrigerator. But it was his. And it worked. The plumbing came next. A simple setup using a rainwater collection system that fed into a small tank, gravity fed to the sink, and a tiny shower stall Ford had built in the very back of the bus. The grey water drained to a small French drain system he dug 20 feet from the bus. It wouldn't pass any city inspection, but out here on Burton's land, it was enough. The bus was becoming fully functional, off-grid, sustainable, a real home, not just a shelter. Word spread through Ridgeland County the way news does in small towns. Gradually at first, then all at once. People Ford had never met knew about the bus project. They'd mention it at the hardware store, at the diner, at church on Sundays. The guy living in a bus, the recovering alcoholic trying to rebuild his life. The father hoping to reconcile with his daughter. Some people were supportive. Others were skeptical. A few were outright hostile, seeing Ford as a cautionary tale or a blight on the community. He tried not to pay attention to the gossip, but in a town of 3,000, you heard things whether you wanted to or not. Then the newspaper called. Stella Granger wrote for the Ridgeland County Gazette, a weekly paper that covered everything from high school sports to town council meetings. She'd heard about the bus and wanted to do a feature story. Human interest piece, she explained, when she showed up at Burton's farm, camera around her neck. Local man rebuilding his life, literally building a home from scratch. People love stories like this. Ford was reluctant. He didn't want attention, didn't want people examining his past or making judgments about his present. But Iris had convinced him it could be good publicity if he ever wanted to restart his carpentry business. And maybe, just maybe, it would show Ainsley that other people believed in his transformation. The interview happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Stella asked thoughtful questions about the build process, about Ford's background in carpentry, about what had inspired him to take on such an unusual project. Ford answered carefully, honestly, without going into detail about the drinking or the divorce or the specific reasons he needed to prove himself. He talked about second chances, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands, about how working with quality materials and traditional techniques connected him to something larger than himself, a lineage of craftsmen stretching back generations. The photographer took dozens of shots, the exterior of the bus gleaming in the sunlight, Ford working with his tools, close-ups of the carved details, the cedar walls, the hand-forged hardware. "This is really something special," Stella said as she packed up her equipment. "Most people would have given up on a project like this. Too hard, too expensive, too much work." "Giving up wasn't an option," Ford said simply. The article ran in the weekend edition under the headline, "From Rust to Revival, Local Carpenter Transforms Abandoned Bus into Home." It was a full-page spread with photos and a detailed account of Ford's building process. The story was fair, even warm, focusing on the craftsmanship and the inspiration rather than dwelling on Ford's troubled past. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, people started showing up at Burton's farm. Some just wanted to look at the bus, to see this remarkable thing they'd read about. Others brought donations, a bag of screws, a can of stain, leftover lumber from their own projects. One elderly woman brought a quilt she'd made, insisting that Ford would need warm blankets for the winter. Ford was grateful but also uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent so long being invisible, being the cautionary tale people whispered about, that being celebrated felt strange and undeserved. Then Helene Blackburn arrived. She drove up in a rental car on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in expensive casual clothes that screamed city money. She introduced herself as a producer for Renewed, a reality show about people who rebuilt homes and lives simultaneously. "We love stories like yours," she said, her enthusiasm aggressive and practiced. Blue-collar guy, hit hard times, pulling himself up by his bootstraps. "America eats this stuff up. I'm not interested in being on television," Ford said. "Think about the exposure. The platform. We could help you launch a real business. Custom furniture, tiny home builds, consulting. The opportunities would be enormous." She named a figure for his participation that made Ford's head spin. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. That kind of money would solve so many problems. He could pay back Iris, help Burton with his medical bills, maybe even have something to show Ainsley that proved he was stable and successful. But something felt wrong about it. The way Helene talked about his struggle, like it was a product to be packaged and sold. The way she wanted to emphasize the drama, the drinking, the divorce, the desperation, rather than the quiet dignity of the work itself. "I appreciate the offer," Ford said. "But this isn't about fame or money. It's personal, private." "Everything has a price," Helene said, her smile fixed. "Think about it. Here's my card." After she left, Ford stood looking at the business card in his hand. Trey had watched the whole interaction from inside the bus. "You're really saying no to that kind of money?" the kid asked. "Yeah. Why?" Ford thought about it. Because some things aren't for sale. He gestured at the bus. This is about proving I can be the man my daughter needs me to be. Putting it on TV, making it into entertainment that would cheapen it somehow. Make it about the wrong things. Trey nodded slowly. That's pretty cool, actually. That you know what matters to you. Took me 44 years to figure it out, Ford said. But yeah, I finally do. They spent the rest of the week on the final interior touches. Ford installed the custom shelving he'd designed, simple but elegant. With the curved brackets he'd shaped from reclaimed iron, he built a small desk that folded down from the wall, perfect for writing or working. He crafted door handles from polished copper pipe and carved wooden knobs for the cabinets. Every detail mattered. Every choice was intentional. This was his masterwork, the best thing he'd ever built, and he wanted it to be perfect. The bus smelled like fresh wood and copper polish and promise. The light coming through the church windows cast patterns on the cedar walls. At night, the LED strips Ford had installed gave off a warm glow that made the small space feel safe and inviting. It was almost done. Another few weeks of detail work, and it would be complete. Burton came by most afternoons now, moving more carefully since his heart episode, but improving steadily. He'd sit in his folding chair and watch Ford work, offering occasional suggestions or just keeping silent company. Opal would have loved this, he said one evening, as the sun set and turned everything golden. She always said that what you build with love shows the love in the building. Ford ran his hand along the smooth cedar wall. You think she'd have approved? I think she'd have said you're doing just fine. Burton stood, steadier than he'd been in weeks. And she'd have been right. That night, Ford sent Ainsley a video tour of the bus. He walked through slowly, showing each section, explaining the choices he'd made, pointing out the details that meant something. The carved vine pattern, the salvaged church windows, the desk that folded away, the small sleeping loft with storage underneath. She replied an hour later, Dad, I can't believe you built all of that. It's like something from a magazine. Preston and I are definitely coming to see it. 2 weeks from Saturday? Ford read the message 3 times, his heart hammering with equal parts hope and terror. 2 weeks, 14 days, 336 hours. Time to finish strong. Time to prove everything. Time to show his daughter that some things, some people really could be transformed from rust into something beautiful. Conway Finch's truck pulled up on a Thursday morning, and Ford knew immediately that something was wrong. The way Conway moved, quick, agitated, clutching a folder against his chest, spoke of crisis. Burton came out of his house at the same time, slower, and Ford saw them meet halfway across the yard. Words were exchanged. Burton's shoulders sagged. Conway put a hand on his father's arm. Ford set down his sandpaper and climbed out of the bus, walking toward them with dread pooling in his stomach. "What's wrong?" he asked when he got close enough. Conway looked at him, and for the first time there was no suspicion in his eyes, just exhaustion and something that might have been sympathy. The medical bills from Dad's cardiac episode came through. Even with Medicare, it's substantial. $28,000. Ford felt the number like a punch. Jesus, I don't have that kind of liquid capital right now, Conway continued. Most of my money is tied up in investments that I can't touch without massive penalties. And Dad's on a fixed income. His savings won't cover it. Burton looked older than Ford had ever seen him, diminished. I have to sell the farm, the old man said quietly. It's the only way to cover the bills and set myself up in assisted living. Can't maintain this place alone anymore anyway. Doctor's orders. Ford's world tilted. Sell the farm? Already have a buyer, Conway said, pulling papers from the folder. Real estate developer named Garrett Strickland. He's been eyeing this land for 2 years, wants to build a subdivision, 40 houses, maybe more. He's offering fair market value, and with Dad's situation, we can't afford to wait for a better offer. When? Ford managed, closing in 30 days. Dad needs to be moved out by then. Everything cleared. Conway looked at Ford, then at the bus. I'm sorry. I know this affects you too. Ford turned to look at his home. The bus that he'd spent 4 months transforming. That sat on land he didn't own. with tires that were rotted through and an engine that hadn't run in 15 years. Moving it would require a flatbed truck, special equipment, permits he couldn't afford. And even if he could move it, where would it go? He had no land, no place to take it. Everything he'd built would have to be dismantled or abandoned. There's no way to... Ford started, then stopped. Of course there was no way. Burton needed the money. His health required it. This wasn't negotiable. "I'm sorry, son," Burton said, and Ford heard the genuine grief in the old man's voice. "You've done beautiful work here. I hate that this is how it has to end." Ford nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He shook Burton's hand, then Conway's, and walked back to the bus on legs that felt disconnected from his body. Inside, surrounded by cedar walls and hand-carved details and everything he'd poured himself into, Ford sat on the built-in bench and stared at his hands. These hands that had created this space. These hands that were about to lose everything again. 30 days. Ainsley was supposed to visit in 2 weeks. She'd see the bus, see what he'd accomplished, and then watch it all fall apart. Watch him fail again, just when he'd almost convinced her, and himself, that he could succeed. The irony was almost funny. He'd built a home on borrowed land, poured months of work into something that was never really his, and now reality was coming to collect. Just like always, just like his business, his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, building on foundations that couldn't hold. He didn't go back to work that day, couldn't bring himself to touch anything, knowing it was all temporary. Instead, he drove to his motel room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bottle of whiskey the previous occupant had left in the drawer. He'd found it weeks ago and kept it there as a test, proof that he could resist, that he was stronger than his addiction. Now looking at that amber liquid, Ford felt the familiar pull, the promise of numbness, the temporary relief from this crushing weight of disappointment and loss. His phone buzzed. Trey probably wondering where he was. Ford ignored it. The phone buzzed again. Burton this time. Ford turned it off. He sat there for 3 hours, just him and the bottle, having a conversation without words. The bottle said it could make everything hurt less. Ford said he'd worked too hard to throw it away now. The bottle said that didn't matter, because he was going to lose everything anyway. Ford said losing while sober was better than losing while drunk. The bottle said that was a lie people told themselves. A knock on the door broke the stalemate. Ford ignored it. The knock came again, more insistent. "Ford, it's Iris. Burton called me." "Open the door." He considered not answering, considered waiting until she went away. But something, maybe just exhaustion, maybe the last shred of his better self, made him stand up and open the door. Iris took one look at his face, then at the bottle on the bed, and walked past him into the room. She picked up the bottle, walked to the bathroom, and poured it down the sink. The sound of whiskey hitting porcelain was both a relief and a loss. "You weren't going to drink it," she said, coming back out. "How do you know?" "Because if you were, you'd have already done it." She sat in the room's only chair, gestured for him to sit on the bed. "Burton told me about the sale." "I'm sorry," Ford sat. 4 months of work, gone. Ainsley was supposed to visit next week, and now she gets to watch me lose everything again. Same story, different details. It's not the same story, isn't it? I built something that wasn't really mine, on a foundation that couldn't last. That's pretty much the story of my life. Iris leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "You want to hear my rock-bottom story?" "The real one?" Ford looked up. "After my ex cleaned out our accounts and left, I tried to keep the store running. But I was drowning. Suppliers wanted payment up front because my credit was shot. Customers were going to the big box store 30 miles away because I couldn't stock what they needed. I was 2 weeks from foreclosure on both the store and my house." She paused, looking at her scarred hands. "I went to my store one morning with a plan to burn it down. Had the insurance, figured it was better to collect that than lose everything and get nothing. I was sitting in my car at 4 in the morning with a gas can in the passenger seat, working up the courage to do it." Ford stared at her. "What stopped you?" "Old Mr. Pacheco, yes, the same one who lives down the hall from you. He was walking his dog, saw me sitting there and knocked on my window. Asked if I was okay, and I just broke down. Told him everything. The debt, the betrayal, the plan to commit insurance fraud. What did he say? He said, that's one plan. But here's another. You open that store tomorrow morning, and I'll be your first customer. And I'll tell everyone I know to come too. And we'll see if we can't build you a different ending. Iris smiled at the memory. He kept his word. He and about 30 other people showed up that next day and bought things they probably didn't need. Started a chain reaction. Within a month, I had enough to make my mortgage payment. Within 6 months, I was breaking even. Within 2 years, I was profitable. She stood, walked to the window. The point is, Ford, I was going to burn down everything I'd built because I couldn't see another way forward. And then someone showed me there were other options. Other people who'd help if I just let them. I can't ask Burton to keep the land. He needs... I'm not talking about Burton, Iris interrupted. The newspaper article has been shared hundreds of times online. Your story resonated with people. There's a whole community out there who've been following your progress, rooting for you. She pulled out her phone, showed Ford a Facebook page he'd never seen before. Trey made this. Without telling you, it's a crowdfunding campaign. Help Ford save his second chance. He posted it 3 days ago with pictures of the bus and your story. Look at how much has been raised. Ford looked at the screen. The number made his breath catch. $15,000 in 3 days. From strangers who'd read about him in the paper or seen the photos online. People believe in you, Iris said softly. They want to help. The money's probably enough to move the bus and lease land somewhere. Or buy a small parcel outright if you can find one cheap enough. Ford scrolled through the comments on the campaign page. Messages from people across the country, sharing their own stories of rebuilding. Thanking him for inspiring them. Wishing him success. Believing in him, even though they'd never met him. I don't deserve this, he whispered. Maybe not. But you're getting it anyway. Iris sat beside him on the bed. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Ford looked at the phone, then at the empty whiskey bottle in the trash, then back at Iris. I don't know where to move it. I can't afford to buy land around here, even with this money. So we figure it out, together. You, me, Burton, Trey, everyone who's been helping you. She stood. But first, you need to get up, get cleaned up, and come back to the bus. Because feeling sorry for yourself doesn't build anything. She was right. Ford knew she was right. But the fear was still there, the certainty that this was all going to fall apart like everything else had. What if I can't do it, he asked. What if this is just another failure? Then it is, Iris said. But at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have failed while moving forward, instead of sitting in a motel room contemplating drinking. That's got to count for something. Ford stood slowly. His legs were steadier than they'd been. Thank you for coming here. For pouring out the whiskey. Thank me by not giving up. Iris headed for the door, then turned back. And Ford, call your daughter. Tell her what happened. Let her be part of figuring out the solution instead of just watching you struggle alone. After she left, Ford sat with his phone for a long time. Then he called Ainsley. She answered on the second ring. Dad? I was just thinking about you. I need to tell you something, Ford said. And then he told her everything. About Burton having to sell the farm, about having 30 days to move the bus, about the crowdfunding campaign he hadn't known existed, about sitting in his motel room with a bottle of whiskey and choosing not to drink it. When he finished, there was silence on the line. Dad, Ainsley said finally, her voice thick with emotion, I'm proud of you. For not drinking, for asking for help, for telling me the truth instead of pretending everything's fine. I'm probably going to lose the bus, Ford said, or have to take it apart. I don't know how to fix this. Then we'll figure it out together, Ainsley said. Preston and I are still coming to visit next weekend. We'll help you find a solution. You're not alone in this, Dad, not anymore. After they hung up, Ford looked around his motel room one more time. Then he picked up his keys and drove back to Burton's farm. Back to the bus. Back to work. Because Iris was right. Feeling sorry for himself didn't build anything. And he still had a home to save. The crowdfunding campaign exploded over the next week. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as community rallies to save man's redemption project. The coverage was sympathetic, focusing on Ford's craftsmanship and the threat from development rather than dwelling too much on his troubled past. The donations accelerated. $20,000, $25,000, $30,000. Ford watched the numbers climb with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Strangers from across the country were investing in his second chance, believing in him when he'd barely learned to believe in himself. But money was only part of the problem. The bigger issue was land. Everything within reasonable distance of Ridgeland County was either farmland already owned by generational families, property too expensive for his budget, or parcels too small or poorly situated for the bus. Ford spent 3 days driving around the county with Burton's outdated land survey maps, looking for possibilities. Every conversation with a landowner ended the same way: polite interest, followed by prices he couldn't afford, or reluctance to lease to someone with his history. On Friday, Garrett Strickland himself showed up at the farm. The developer was in his 50s, silver-haired and expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Baxter," he said, extending his hand, "I've been reading about your situation. Quite the interesting project you've undertaken here." Ford shook his hand warily. "Mr. Strickland, call me Garrett. I wanted to see the bus for myself before we finalized the purchase." He walked around the exterior, looking at it with the appraising eye of someone calculating value. "Impressive work. You're clearly talented. Thank you. I had an idea I wanted to run by you." Garrett turned to face him. "What if the bus stayed? We could incorporate it into the development as a kind of community art installation, a focal point for the neighborhood. You'd have to move it to the entrance area, of course, but it would remain on the property." Ford felt a flicker of hope. "You'd be willing to do that?" "If you were willing to sign over ownership and maintain it as part of the Homeowners Association agreement. No living in it, obviously. HOA regulations wouldn't allow that. But as a sculptural piece, a conversation starter, I think it could add value to the development." The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. "So I'd give up the bus but couldn't live in it." "The subdivision will have strict residential codes. A converted bus wouldn't meet those standards as a dwelling." Garrett's tone was reasonable, almost apologetic. "But this way your work would be preserved. People would see it, appreciate it. Better than having it dismantled or junked, isn't it?" "It's not art," Ford said quietly. "It's my home," Garrett sighed. "I understand you're emotionally attached. But be realistic, Mr. Baxter. You have 3 weeks to figure out where to move an immobile vehicle that weighs several tons. The crowdfunding money might cover the moving costs, but you still need land. And from what I hear, you haven't found any. Not yet. My offer stands if you change your mind." "Think about it." Garrett handed Ford a business card. "Sometimes preserving something in a different form is better than losing it entirely." After the developer left, Ford stood looking at the bus with fresh eyes. Garrett was right about the practical challenges. Moving it would be expensive and complicated. Finding affordable land was proving impossible. And even if he managed both, would he have enough money left over to live on while he tried to restart his carpentry business? Maybe the smart thing was to accept Garrett's offer. At least the bus would survive in some form. At least all his work wouldn't be completely wasted. But the thought of the bus sitting empty, a decoration for wealthy families in a subdivision, made him feel sick. This wasn't supposed to be art. It was supposed to be proof that he could build a life, not just a conversation piece. Trey arrived that afternoon with Burton, both looking anxious. "People are still donating," Trey said, showing Ford his phone. "We're up to 34,000. But Mr. Finch said you still haven't found land." "Not yet." Ford couldn't quite meet Burton's eyes. "Conway's been making calls too," Burton said, "checking with people he knows from growing up here." "So far, nothing." They stood in uncomfortable silence, all of them aware that time was running out and options were running thin. Ford's phone rang. "Ainsley, Dad, we're leaving the city now. Should be there in about 3 hours." She paused. "Have you found any solutions yet?" "Still working on it," Ford said, which wasn't quite a lie. "Okay, we'll help brainstorm when we get there. Preston's actually pretty good at problem solving. Architect brain." After they hung up, Ford looked at Burton and Trey. My daughter's coming. She's going to see this whole thing fall apart. She's going to see you fighting for it, Burton corrected. That's different than falling apart. Ford spent the next 2 hours finishing the last details on the bus, driven by a need to have it perfect when Ainsley arrived. He installed the final cabinet door, adjusted the tension on the hinges, polished the copper fixtures until they gleamed. The bus was complete. Every surface finished, every detail resolved. It was the best work he'd ever done, and in 3 weeks it would all have to be dismantled or abandoned. Ainsley and Preston arrived at sunset. Ford heard the car and walked out to meet them, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't seen his daughter in person in over 2 years. She got out of the passenger side, still beautiful, still achingly familiar, but different too. More confident, more self-possessed. The woman she'd become while he wasn't watching. "Hi, Dad," she said, and there was warmth in her voice that Ford hadn't dared hope for. "Hi, sweetheart." He wanted to hug her but wasn't sure if he'd earned that right yet. Ainsley solved the problem by stepping forward and embracing him. Not long, not desperately, but real. Ford closed his eyes and tried to memorize the moment. His daughter in his arms, choosing to be there. "This is Preston," she said, stepping back and gesturing to the tall man beside her. Preston shook Ford's hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "Good to finally meet you, sir. Ainsley's told me a lot about you." "Probably nothing good," Ford said. "Some hard things," Preston acknowledged, "but also about how talented you are, how much you meant to her growing up." He looked toward the bus. "Is that it?" Ford led them over, opened the door, let them step inside. Ainsley's reaction was everything he'd hoped for. She moved through the space slowly, touching the cedar walls, running her fingers over the carved details, opening cabinets to see the dovetail joints and the smooth sliding drawers. "Dad," she breathed, "this is incredible. You built all of this? With some help?" "But yeah, mostly me." Preston was examining the joinery, the way the curved space had been divided, the clever storage solutions. "This is professional-level work. Better than professional, actually. This is artistry." They sat together in the small living area, and Ford explained the whole project from beginning to end. Finding the bus, convincing Burton to let him use it, the months of work, the crowdfunding campaign, the impending sale. "So you have 3 weeks to find land and move it?" Ainsley asked. 2.5 now. "And you haven't found anything?" Ford shook his head. "Everything's too expensive or too far away, or owners won't lease to someone like me. Someone like you." Ainsley's voice sharpened. "What does that mean?" "Someone with my history. Failed business, divorce, alcoholism. Not exactly a landlord's dream tenant." Preston leaned forward. "What if you bought instead of leased? With the crowdfunding money. Can't afford anything around here. Even raw land is expensive because developers want it. What about outside the county? Farther rural? Then I'm too far from potential work, from my support system, from the AA meetings I need." They sat in silence, the problem seeming as immovable as the bus itself. Then Ainsley said quietly, "What about the developer's offer? To keep it as an installation?" Ford looked at her, surprised she knew about it. "Burton mentioned it when we called yesterday," she explained. "Is that an option?" "It means giving up ownership. Means it becomes decoration instead of home." Ford looked around at the space he'd created. "I didn't build this to be looked at. I built it to live in, to prove I could create something real and lasting." "You already proved that," Ainsley said, her eyes glistening. "Dad, look at this place. Look at what you built. Whether you live in it or not doesn't change what you accomplished. It changes what it means," Ford said. Preston stood, walked to the window. "There has to be a solution we're not seeing." They spent Saturday morning driving around the county, the 3 of them in Preston's car, looking at parcels that might work. Everything was either prohibitively expensive, too remote, or unsuitable for the bus. By lunch, they were back at Burton's farm, discouraged and running out of ideas. Burton had made sandwiches. They sat under the oak tree. Ford, Ainsley, Preston, Burton, and Trey, who'd arrived on his bike, eating and talking through increasingly unlikely scenarios. "What if we started a non-profit?" Trey suggested. "Like the bus becomes an educational thing about sustainability and tiny living." "Still need land," Ford said. "What if you bought land with multiple people? Like a co-op?" Preston offered. "We'd need to find people willing to invest, and that takes time we don't have." They went in circles for an hour, each idea hitting the same walls: time, money, availability. Conway's truck pulled up around 2 o'clock. He got out slowly, looking at the group gathered under the tree, then walked over with an envelope in his hand. "Dad," he said to Burton, "can I talk to you?" "And Ford?" They walked a little distance away from the others. Conway opened the envelope and pulled out legal documents. "I've been working with our family attorney all week," he said, "and I want to propose something." He looked at Ford. "When I first met you, I thought you were taking advantage of my father's kindness. I was wrong about that, and I apologize." Ford nodded, throat tight. "What you've built here is remarkable. And watching how the community has rallied around you, the crowdfunding, the support, it's reminded me of something my mother used to say, that the measure of a place is how it treats people who are trying to do better." Conway handed the documents to Burton. "Before we sell the farm, I'm having the attorney parcel off 1 acre, the acre where the bus sits. Dad's transferring the deed to Ford as a gift." Ford felt the world tilt. "What? No, Burton needs the money. The buyer's already agreed to the adjustment," Conway interrupted. "The sale price reflects the reduced acreage. It's a negligible difference to him, but everything to you." "I can't accept this," Ford said, looking at Burton. "Your medical bills are going to be paid by the crowdfunding money," Burton said quietly. "If you'll let it happen that way." Ford stared at him. "The campaign was for moving the bus. The campaign was for saving your second chance," Burton corrected. "People donated to help you." "Well, helping you means helping me, too. The medical bills are $28,000. The campaign's at $36,000 now. That covers the bills and gives you a cushion to get started." "Burton, that's your land, your family's land, and I'm choosing to give 1 acre of it to someone who's become like family." The old man's voice was firm. "Opal would have done the same. Hell, she'd have done it sooner." Conway spoke up. "I opposed this initially. Thought Dad was being taken advantage of. But I've watched you work, watched you stay sober despite every reason to give up, watched you build something beautiful while your whole world was falling apart." He held out his hand. "You've earned this, Ford." Ford shook Conway's hand, then turned to Burton. Words failed him completely. He pulled the old man into a hug, feeling Burton's fragile frame, the tremor in his hands, the strength that remained despite everything. "I don't know what to say," Ford managed. "Say you'll accept it," Burton said. "Say you'll keep building good things. That's payment enough." They walked back to the others. Ainsley stood when she saw Ford's face, concern immediate. "What happened?" Ford couldn't speak. He just handed her the deed transfer documents. Ainsley read them, her eyes widening. She looked at Burton, then at Conway, then at her father. "You're giving him the land?" 1 acre, Burton confirmed. "The bus and the land it sits on. It's Ford's now." Ainsley's eyes filled with tears. She walked to Burton and hugged him. "Thank you. Thank you for believing in him." Preston was reading over the documents. This is incredibly generous. "And the crowdfunding money covers your medical expenses?" "With room to spare," Conway said. "Which means Ford can use what's left to start his furniture business. Maybe build a small workshop on his acre." Trey was grinning so hard his face looked like it might split. "So the bus stays?" "It all worked out?" "It all worked out," Ford echoed, still not quite believing it. They spent the rest of the afternoon celebrating. Iris drove out when she heard the news, bringing champagne, sparkling cider for Ford, and hugging everyone in sight. Other people from town started arriving as word spread, wanting to congratulate Ford, to see the bus, to be part of the happy ending. As the sun began to set, Ainsley took Ford aside. They walked to the edge of Burton's property, looking out over the fields that would soon become a subdivision, except for 1 small acre that would remain wild. "I have something for you," Ainsley said. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This arrived at Mom's house a few weeks ago. She forwarded it to me." Ford opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation, formal and elegant, addressed to Mr. Ford Baxter. "You're inviting me?" His voice cracked. "I want you to walk me down the aisle," Ainsley said. "I want you there, Dad. You've proven you've changed. Not just with the bus, but with how you handled losing it. You didn't drink. You asked for help. You let people support you. That's the father I needed you to be. Ford pulled his daughter into his arms and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being forgiven, of being given another chance and not wasting it. I'm so proud of you, Ainsley whispered. Not for building the bus, for building yourself back into someone I can trust, someone I want in my life. They stood there as the light faded, father and daughter, the distance between them finally closed. When they walked back, Preston was examining the acre with an architect's eye. You know what you should build here? He said to Ford. A small workshop. I could draw up plans if you want. Something simple but functional. I'd like that, Ford said. Burton was sitting in his chair, Iris beside him, both of them watching the celebration with satisfied expressions. You did good, old man, Iris said to Burton. We all did good, Burton corrected. Whole community did this. Not just me. Ford looked around at the people gathered on his acre, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged, like he had a place in the world and people who believed in him. The bus sat gleaming in the last light, every surface reflecting the care that had gone into its creation. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was proof. Proof that broken things could be made beautiful, that people could change, that second chances were real if you were willing to work for them. Ford's phone buzzed. A text from Shauna, his ex-wife. Ainsley told me the news. I'm happy for you, Ford. Really, you did it. He stood there holding his phone, surrounded by friends and family, owner of 1 acre of earth and a converted school bus, and realized something profound. He was home. Finally, truly home. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. Ford sat in a leather chair that had seen decades of people signing important documents, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning. Burton sat beside him, Conway on the other side. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Rains, who'd handled the Finch family's legal matters for 30 years, laid out the deed transfer documents with practiced efficiency. This is relatively straightforward, Patricia explained. Mr. Finch is transferring ownership of 1 acre, legally described here, she pointed to the survey description, to Ford Baxter. Free and clear. No lions, no encumbrances. The parcel includes the bus and a 20-foot easement for access from the county road. Ford looked at the documents, at the legal language that would make him a landowner. I still don't feel right about this. We've been over this, Burton said firmly. The sale to Strickland goes through with the adjusted acreage. My medical bills get paid by the crowdfunding money. Everyone gets what they need, but your family's land is going to strangers anyway, Conway interrupted, not unkindly. At least this way, 1 acre stays with someone Dad cares about, someone who'll honor it. Patricia slid the papers across the desk. If everyone's in agreement, we need signatures here, here, and here. Burton signed first, his signature shaky but determined. Then Ford, his hand more steady than he'd expected. Conway witnessed both signatures. Congratulations, Mr. Baxter, Patricia said. You're now the owner of 1 acre in Ridgeland County. Walking out of the lawyer's office into the bright afternoon, Ford felt weightless. He looked at the deed in his hands, official, recorded, real. His name on a piece of land, something that couldn't be taken away by bad decisions or bad luck. Burton clapped him on the shoulder. How's it feel? Terrifying, Ford admitted. Like I'm going to wake up and it'll all be gone. Welcome to property ownership, Conway said with a slight smile. That feeling never completely goes away. They drove back to the farm, to Ford's acre now, where Trey was waiting with Iris. The kid had been working all morning, clearing brush and marking out where a workshop might go, using stakes and string to outline possibilities. I've been thinking about the layout, Trey said, showing Ford his rough sketches. Workshop here so it catches morning light. Maybe a small deck outside the bus? And we could plant trees along this edge for privacy once the subdivision goes up. Ford looked at the drawings, touched by the kid's investment in the project. These are good ideas. Preston sent some preliminary sketches too, Iris added, pulling up images on her phone. Nothing final, just concepts. A timber frame workshop, maybe 12 by 16 with a covered porch. The designs were simple but elegant, perfectly suited to the space and Ford's needs. A place to build furniture, to practice his craft, to earn a living doing what he loved. The crowdfunding account has 8,000 left after Burton's medical bills, Iris said. That's enough for materials if we're smart about it. Labor could be volunteer. Trey, me, some folks from town who've offered to help. I could have it up in a month, Trey said eagerly. We work weekends and evenings, get it closed in before winter. Ford felt overwhelmed by their generosity, their willingness to keep investing in his success. I don't know how to thank you all. Build beautiful things, Burton said simply. That's thanks enough. That evening, Ford walked his acre as the sun set, really seeing it for the first time as his own. The gentle slope of the land, the old oak tree that would provide summer shade, the view across Burton's fields, soon to be Strickland's subdivision, but still beautiful in the fading light. He stood beside the bus and ran his hand along its metal skin, feeling the warmth retained from the day's sun. This vehicle that had been junk, forgotten, rusting into the earth, was now the centerpiece of his new life. His phone rang. Ainsley. Dad, I've been thinking about the wedding. Yeah? I want to do something different for the father-daughter dance. Instead of a traditional song, I want to dance to one we can both connect to. Do you remember that James Taylor song you used to play when I was little? You've got a friend? Ford's throat tightened. He'd played that song constantly when Ainsley was young, singing it to her when she couldn't sleep, playing it in the truck when they drove to his job sites. I remember. That's the song I want. Because that's what you're becoming again, Dad, my friend. Someone I can count on. After they hung up, Ford sat on the bus steps and let himself cry. Not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being allowed back into his daughter's life, of being worthy of that trust. Dre found him there an hour later, sitting in the darkness. You okay? The kid asked. Yeah, just thinking about how much has changed in 4 months. Trey sat beside him. Can I tell you something? My dad leaving messed me up, made me angry, made me do stupid things. When I started helping you build this, it was just about the community service hours. But then it became about having someone who showed up, who did what they said they'd do, who taught me stuff and didn't give up when things got hard. Trey, I'm saying thank you, the kid continued, for letting me be part of this, for being the kind of man I want to be when I'm your age. Ford put his arm around Trey's shoulders. You're going to be better than me, kid. You're already halfway there. They sat in comfortable silence, looking at Ford's acre under the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a truck rumbled past on the county road. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered secrets. Tomorrow we start on the workshop? Trey asked. Tomorrow we start on the workshop, Ford confirmed. But tonight, he would sit here with this kid who'd become like family, on land that was his, beside a home he'd built with his own hands, and feel grateful for every hard moment that had led him to this place. Burton's words echoed in his memory. Sometimes we need to tear something all the way down before we can build it back right. Ford had been torn down by his own choices, by circumstances, by the weight of his failures. But he'd built himself back. Not perfectly, not without scars, but solidly. With good bones and a foundation that would last. He was home. He was forgiven. He was building a future. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. 6 months later, Ford Baxter stood in front of the mirror in his bus home, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. His hands were shaking, not from withdrawal or fear, but from the simple nervousness of a father about to walk his daughter down the aisle. The bus looked different now, lived in and loved. Books lined the shelves he'd built. Photographs in handmade frames showed the journey, Burton and him at the deed signing. Trey holding up the first wall of the workshop, Ainsley's first visit. The whole community gathered for a barn raising that had become a workshop raising. Outside, the acre had transformed. The workshop stood solid and beautiful, its timber frame exactly as Preston had designed. Inside, Ford's custom furniture business was thriving. 3 commissions already completed, 2 more in progress, and a waiting list that stretched into autumn. The subdivision construction had started on Burton's former land, the sound of hammers and saws a constant backdrop. But Ford's acre remained untouched, an island of calm surrounded by development. The trees Trey had planted were still small, but they'd grow. Everything grew given time and care. Burton visited most afternoons, driving from his new apartment in town, moving slower but steady. His health had stabilized with proper medication and regular care. They'd share lunch at the small picnic table Ford had built, watching the subdivision take shape and talking about everything and nothing. Iris had started carrying Ford's smaller pieces in the hardware store, cutting boards, wooden bowls, carved boxes. They sold as fast as he could make them. Word was spreading about the quality of his work, about the man who'd rebuilt his life from rust and determination. Trey came by 3 times a week, learning advanced techniques, talking about maybe studying furniture design at the community college. His mother had met Ford once, shaken his hand with tears in her eyes, and thanked him for giving her son something to believe in. Ford checked his watch. Time to go. The wedding was in the city, an hour's drive, and he'd promised Ainsley he'd be early. He picked up the small wooden box from his shelf, the one he'd been working on for weeks. Cedar, like the bus walls, carved with the same vine pattern. Inside, he'd placed a letter to Ainsley, words he'd written and rewritten until they felt true. The drive to the city felt both too long and too short. Ford's truck, newer now, reliable, paid for with furniture commissions, handled the highway easily. He'd made this drive 12 times in the past months, visiting Ainsley and Preston, slowly rebuilding the relationship that had been shattered. The wedding venue was a converted barn, rustic and elegant. Ford arrived 2 hours early, as promised. Ainsley was in the bridal suite, surrounded by friends and flowers and the controlled chaos of final preparations. When she saw him, she broke away from the makeup artist and crossed the room. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, every inch the beautiful, confident woman she'd become. "Dad," she said and hugged him. "You made it. Wouldn't miss this for anything in the world." They stepped outside for a moment of quiet before the ceremony. Ford handed her the wooden box. "I made this for you. For today." Ainsley opened it, found the letter. She read it, standing there in her wedding dress, and Ford watched tears streak her carefully applied makeup. The letter said everything he'd never been able to say before. About his pride in the woman she'd become. About his gratitude for her forgiveness. About how building the bus had taught him that broken things could be made beautiful if you were willing to do the work. It said he loved her, that he was sorry, that he would spend the rest of his life being the father she deserved. "Dad," Ainsley whispered, clutching the letter, "this is the best gift you could have given me. I have one more thing." Ford pulled out his phone, showed her photos of the workshop. "I've been building something. For you and Preston. A dining table. Walnut and cherry, seats 8. It'll be ready in a month. For your first home together." Ainsley looked at the photos, the wood grain, the joinery, the carved details. "It's gorgeous. It's strong," Ford said. "It'll last generations. Like the love I have for you." The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Ford walked Ainsley down the aisle, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He placed her hand in Preston's, stepped back, and watched his daughter become a wife. During the reception, they danced to "You've Got a Friend." Ford held Ainsley and remembered all the years of being absent, of being lost in bottles and shame. And he held her now, present and sober and grateful beyond measure. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Ainsley whispered as they swayed. "Not just for building the bus, for building yourself into someone I can trust again. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart, for giving me another chance, for believing I could change." When the song ended, Preston shook Ford's hand and said quietly, "Take care of yourself. She needs you in her life." "I will," Ford promised. "I am." Ford drove back to Ridgeland County that night, back to his acre and his bus and his workshop. He parked near the oak tree and sat for a moment, looking at what he'd built. The bus lights glowed warm through the windows. The workshop stood solid in the moonlight. His acre, small but his, stretched out in every direction. He'd lost everything before finding what truly mattered. His home wasn't the bus, though he loved it. His home was in the work of his hands, in the relationships he'd rebuilt, in the man he was becoming one day at a time. Ford stepped inside the bus, into the space he'd created from nothing. He made tea on the small stove, sat at the fold-down desk, and pulled out the wooden bird he'd carved months ago. It still sat on the shelf, a reminder of what was possible. Tomorrow he'd start work on Ainsley's dining table. The wood was already selected, the design finalized. It would be his masterpiece, built with all the skill and love he possessed. But tonight, he sat in his home, his real, actual, legal home, and felt peace settle over him like a blessing. Sometimes a man loses everything before he finds what truly matters. Sometimes rust can shine. Sometimes, if you do the work, broken things become beautiful. Ford Baxter had done the work, and the man looking back at him from the window's reflection was someone he recognized, someone he could respect, someone who'd earned his way home. He was exactly where he needed to be.